Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. How do you tackle an adversary that doesn't play by the rules? It seems almost a foregone conclusion that Russia will invade Ukraine beyond the Donbass region, and the US and its Western allies seem at a loss on how to respond. Our next guest is well placed to analyze the problem. He spent much of the last 2 decades at the heart of NATO. He's Mark Laity, formerly Director of NATO's Communications Division. Hello and welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm very glad that you're here. It's going to be a really interesting hour. Many people listening here today will remember you as a spokesman for NATO during the 2000s, but if you're in Australia or Canada, they perhaps might not know you so much with your career in the BBC. Can you just tell us a bit about your background first?
Yeah, before I joined NATO, I was a journalist in various editorial positions, but what matters most in this context is that from 1989, I was the BBC's defence correspondent. So I covered most of the wars of the next decade. Then in 2000, I went over to NATO, where I was a special advisor to the then Secretary General, Lord Robertson. And then after that, I became initially a special advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, in other words, the Chief Operational Commander of NATO. And then from that point on, I had various posts. I did operational deployments in Macedonia, Kosovo, and most notably Afghanistan. And from that, I set up strategic communications within NATO's military and to a large extent within NATO as a whole. So my nickname became Mr StratCom because of my obsessive desire to get strategic communications to the center of NATO.
Okay, well, we're going to delve into that in a few minutes' time, really, to look at what strategic communications are. But I want to also sort of create an arc, a story to try and examine Russia's movements. And really, over that time period, I think since you left the BBC and joined NATO, and it's a fascinating sort of change in flow of affairs. But just before that, let's just look at one incident to perhaps illustrate the low point of Russia's power, perhaps in international affairs. And that's right back in June 1999 at Pristina Airport. What happened there?
Oh, well, that one was NATO had been bombing Kosovo, and the Serbs, in order to, as Robin Cook put it, to get the Kosovars back, the Serbs out, and NATO in. Russia was a conditional Serb backer. We wanted them to be part of what became KFOR. They decided to jump the gun, and they moved in a load of forces from Bosnia, who went in overland, but they also wanted to fly in a lot of paratroopers up to a division, which meant they had to overfly countries which had been part of the Warsaw Pact and were now joining NATO.
Just before you say what happened there, what was their interest there, and what was actually I mean, here is NATO essentially going into a former communist country. It's not obviously former Yugoslavia wasn't in the Soviet realm, but it's certainly more closer to Russia than it would be to the West and a communist country itself. But there's a sense here of perhaps of Russian powerlessness.
Yes, very much. I mean, the Serbs in particular, for historical as well as political reasons, very much look to Russia. And to a degree, my friend, good or bad. And so they looked to the Russians to defend the Serbs from all that was happening to them. So when it came to the point that NATO was going to move in through KFOR, of which Russia would be a part, into Kosovo, they somehow hoped that if the Russians got in first, it would sort of protect their interests within Pristina and beyond. And the Russians, I think, also wanted to demonstrate they could do what they wanted when they wanted. So when they set off from Bosnia, they never sought permission, they just evacuated. And they were in effect doing a unilateral run to seize a part of Kosovo. And part of that was to fly in paratroopers, and the ground troops were there to seize Pristina Airport, which they did. But then when the Russians wanted to overfly former Warsaw Pact nations, the former Warsaw Pact nations said, no, you won't. And they refused them permission. And when the Russians said, well, we could just fly anyway, in effect, they sort of did a Clint Eastwood and say, yeah, make my day. And the Russians then realized that they couldn't just bully their way in, and they didn't. And that actually meant that the Russian forces in Pristina Airport were isolated, and in the end needed British troops and others to feed them and give them water. So it was a very symbolic indication of the end, you know, the end of the Cold War actually meant something, and the Russians were very much put in their place. They didn't want K4 there in the first place, and then when they tried to control K4 by doing a traditional Russian end run, they were stopped.
There was an amazing moment when General Mike Jackson actually went by himself to the road approaching Pristina Airport, where he was met, where he saw there was a Russian paratrooper or a Russian soldier there, and he basically said, "Take me to your, commanding officer," and somehow the message got through. But there was this real sense of sort of Cold War standoff. But the thing that fascinates me there, it sort of reminds me of Little Green Men, but it didn't work, and it illustrated Russian powerlessness. But the Russians were determined that that would never happen again, and that they would be able to use their forces, as where they wanted to, as they wanted to. So let's roll the clock forward. You left the BBC at the end of 99, 2000. So you've got a different hat on. You've had a fascinating career in the 2000s. We'll talk about Afghanistan in just a second. But I want to roll forward. Vladimir Putin obviously becomes prime minister and then president of Russia. And he lays down a line in the sand, if you like, with a speech made in Munich. And I think this was, and we were talking about this just earlier, this was in, was it April 2007? When did this take place? Can you remember?
It was 2007. And to give it the context, NATO, the West had got on reasonably well with Yeltsin. There had been the expansion of NATO, the enlargement is the term NATO prefers to use, to take in effect, the whole of the Warsaw Pact, and then ultimately former Soviet Union states such as Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. You have to understand, Putin is an unreconstructed Russian. He hated what was happening. People will be aware he was the one who called it the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Yeltsin, Gorbachev, all of these people were to a degree recognized the world had changed. Putin recognized the world had changed and he hated it. He absolutely loathed it. And then he saw what he regarded as the further humiliations of Russia. And in Munich in 2007 at the annual security conference, in which in effect the security chiefs, the apparatchiks, the main thinkers all appear once a year. Actually it's in February, and he did a speech there to all of them, and he basically rang the changes, and he said, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Now, to be honest, I didn't think the Russians had been that nice anyway, and I'd been in NATO, but relatively, this was a very chilling moment in which he basically said, we don't like you anymore. And he actually indicated that Russia was going to take a hard line.
But he also said that NATO had broken its promises. The former leader of his name escapes me in the early 90s, had suggested that there was the USSR had the security in that NATO was not going to expand beyond a certain point. And I guess this was a message that was made in a certain context when the USSR existed. But Putin took this promise, or took this statement, and applied it to the current day, back to the 2000s. Well,
I mean, what exactly went on? This was really to do with the unification of Germany and the negotiations around the unification of Germany. James Baker, the US Secretary of State, said something to the effect of, well, maybe NATO doesn't need to expand or something like that. He's not only was he not speaking for NATO, he wasn't even speaking for the US. He was spitballing, as they would put it, and he had to row back. And in the following years, there was a lot of toing and froing, a lot of statements made, some of which could be taken in a certain way, and some of which did indeed sort of allude, well, we're not sure how much we want to expand or whether we should, but nothing was written down, nothing was agreed, nothing was certain. And the Russians have cherry-picked things that were said and said, you promised us you wouldn't expand. Now, as maybe a Cold War warrior, I find this laughable, simply because if you look at Soviet history, since when have the Russians ever decided that something that's not written in blood needs to be taken seriously? I mean, they have, not only have they routinely broken statements they have signed, you know, agreements,
including agreeing to protect Ukraine when it gave up nuclear weapons.
Yeah, the OSCE Helsinki Agreement. Not only have they broken things they signed, real documents, but also beyond that, if you had said to a Russian, well, you told us, the first thing a Russian would say is, did I, and where is it written down? So he means it, he's angry, but to be honest, it's not to be taken seriously.
Okay, well, it's clear in a way, perhaps, that NATO hasn't taken it too seriously. But let's leave that to the side. Before Georgia's taken place, certainly before Donbass and the Crimea have taken place.
Yeah, 1 year before Georgia.
So one year before Georgia. So, but let's not go to that just yet. Let's talk about NATO's internal operations. In 2006, you're sent to Afghanistan, I think, with the ARC, which is the British-led contingent of forces based in Kandahar. Is that right?
Well, they were the ARC is the ACE Rapid Reaction Corps, or the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. It's NATO's most ready corps headquarters, and so they were actually sent to take over what's ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force. So they ran everything, and they were based in Kabul. And I was the media advisor to the commander of ISAF, a British general, and also the spokesman for NATO there. So, and I got sent there at short notice, basically because we were already seeing that the communications problems that we were having in a growing counterinsurgency weren't working. So I was basically sent there as a kind of an emergency response with this nagging sense that it wasn't going to go well. And indeed, when I got there, it damn well wasn't going well.
So what does that mean? I mean, in terms of the communication strategy, what did you think was wrong? And how did you go about changing that? And did you have any success? Because the point about this is the lessons learned that you took when you came back to Brussels.
Absolutely. The thing, we were in a counterinsurgency, and a counterinsurgency has a very strong military and civil component. A counterinsurgency is much more about psychology. It's much more about all of the units of power. It's not a classic kinetic operation. It's not military. In a way, it's like a hybrid conflict in the sense that the civil aspects are as important as the military and so on. And when we went there, the Taliban had a very strong narrative. They had a very strong psychological warfare set up, although they'd never call it that. They very much aligned their actions with their words. In other words, they were pretty damn good. NATO, very inexperienced media people, very under-resourced, extremely split up. So the elements of communication, public affairs, psychological operations, information operations, all split, none of them aligned, not properly integrated to all the other operations. So when it came to information, we had some really good people, but they were completely disconnected. They didn't have the authority. They weren't linked in. The whole communication strategy was just disaster. It was a complete disaster. So after 2 or 3 months of basically seeing the Taliban's information effort really outpacing us, we sat down, we literally whiteboarded the problem. I have a photograph of the whiteboard, and we said, what should we do? How should we organize? And what we decided to do is actually the key elements of what is still the strategic communication, but at the operational level. Now, the communications in NATO communications in Afghanistan's a pretty up and down story, but we did pretty well. And whenever we applied the model that we developed operationally, we did much better. I came back from Afghanistan and I said, this is what we need to apply strategically and at the highest level. I was appointed the StratCom chief, very small cell, and I basically spent the next 10 years agitating for this with support from other people and strong opposition from others. Because
let me just stop you there. I mean, it's going to become very apparent when we talk about the conflict with Ukraine, and you think about the Baltic states, the threat they feel. I mean, we're going to talk about hybrid warfare and the necessity for the things you talk about are going to become very apparent. But just going back to Afghanistan, can you give us a concrete example of where perhaps there was a failure, where things didn't join up, and then how it could have been better addressed, just to illustrate the problem? Yeah, well, I'll give you a couple of very brief ones. We didn't have, we had no real understanding of the information environment. We had no proper linkages with the cultural aspects of it. So when we were messaging, we were not, to the Afghans, we were not just literally in a different language, we were metaphorically in a different language. So you didn't understand the people you were speaking to in a way, really? And they didn't understand us. Yeah. So we didn't understand them, they didn't understand us. But also we weren't linked with the operations. If you have the Taliban, when they were doing an operation, they immediately thought, well, what is the psychological impact? So they would film things almost automatically. We were doing operations in order to achieve a traditional military effect, but we weren't taking in, well, what's the actual psychological effect? What's the information effect? And it was things, and then that was structurally the case. We weren't linking up. They didn't know what we wanted. And you would have things like, whenever a bomb missed its target, we were completely all over the place. We couldn't find out what was happening. We couldn't sort out what we should say about it. We weren't talking to each other. So we lost a lot of credibility through the Taliban lying about bombs missing or us not explaining bombs missing. So at every level, we weren't coordinated. Okay. When did you came back? When did you come back from Afghanistan? I came back in February 2007. So you actually come back February 2007. That's when Putin makes a speech, and then the same month. And when does Georgia take place? Georgia takes place in November 2008. That's interesting because in April 2008, there was the Bucharest summit. At the Bucharest summit, NATO said that in the very long term, they were prepared to have Ukraine and Georgia as members. Now, this was a compromise because the Americans wanted to give them what's called the Membership Action Plan, which is a solid pathway to membership. Other nations, for instance, Germany, were saying they didn't want to touch them. So the compromise was not to have them as member action plan, which is like a commitment, but to say in the long term, ultimately you can be members. This, many people who were very pro-NATO, very anti-Russian, would say was a mistake, simply because it was bound to rile the Russians while not actually really helping the Ukrainians and the Georgians. Other people take a different view, but I think there is a very clear link between the Bucharest summit with regard to Georgia in April 2008 and the Russian, effectively, they provoked a war in November 2008. Right. And I think there's a very clear link between the two. So basically the link is Russia sees NATO getting into its own backyard and says, right, it's really time to put a stop to this. We're going to talk more about that in terms of Ukraine, but in terms of that conflict, how did you see that? How did you assess that when that took place in terms of with your StratCom hat on?
Well, I think, first of all, it caught us by surprise. And therefore, our response as a NATO alliance was erratic. There was no real agreement within NATO about how we should respond. So our response was a bit all over the place. And you can only be as good as the political policy behind it, and you're having a narrative. NATO wasn't sure what to do, other than they didn't like Russia doing what it was doing. But they didn't know what was going on. The Russians had a fairly effective counter narrative, blaming Saakashvili for provoking it, which wasn't really true, but he did do some stupid stuff.
Yeah.
And as a result, we didn't handle it very well. The Russians had a lot of problems of their own, but most of them were military. And it was the Americans who probably did most to basically warn off the Russians as to how far they would proceed. And I think it wasn't so much NATO who stopped the Russians, it was more the United States and some of the allies. It was afterwards.
Famously, Sarkozy went in and had some direct talks with the Russians to pull them back. We get to Crimea and then Donbass, and the idea of hybrid warfare appears, but I think you're already thinking about this sometime before that. Can you explain a bit more? And this is again talking about how StratCom develops. As you get home, you develop this unit just with 3 people, and then you begin to think, you begin to try and persuade other colleagues within NATO to think along much more, not just in terms of where you deploy troops, but how you deal with propaganda, how you deal with psyops, also information generally, but also, and then also in the technological side of it as well.
Well, I think the thing about hybrid warfare is it's a term I don't especially like. It's one we've got and we're stuck with it. The Russians, interestingly, when they talk about hybrid warfare, they apply it to NATO, not to themselves. More accurately, hybrid warfare is as old as Sun Tzu, frankly. It's about the kind of operations which are what's often called the gray zone. Operations short of a full-blown conflict. And so it's what's going on now, which is often what's going on before the big guns start being used. And if you're not using the big guns, what are your weapons? Quite clearly, they're not the big guns by definition. And the Russians would probably call this information confrontation or political warfare. And that's what they were doing in the Cold War, in which you use subversion, propaganda, active intelligence operations to make things happen, not just spy. Nowadays, cyber warfare, all of these things are elements of hybrid warfare, which is activities short of a full-scale war. Now, NATO is orientated to full-scale war. And what was quite obvious to me and others, I don't want to sound like I'm some Cassandra alone in the desert.
Yeah.
It's obvious to me that the kind of fighting, the kind of conflict that Russia was going to inflict on us, and frankly the Chinese, would be one where you would not have a full-blown conflict. They would try and achieve their objective short of that. So then when you look at your instruments of power, short of full-blown conflict, what are they? Well, one of them is communications, deterrence, and look at the effort and the weight and the effectiveness of Russian narratives to dismay, distract, divert, to persuade people. to prevent us doing things, putting up things that they believe will stop us doing stuff, and also the way that they align them with military action. So in Crimea, it was quite obvious they realized that they had to minimize the use of violence. So their Spetsnaz were very, very careful to act in a way that avoided violence. It's an extraordinarily bloodless conflict. On the other hand, you then take it to the Donbass, where they tried that at first, and then when they realized that the Ukrainians were really fighting back with considerable success, they used extreme violence. So for them, violence was a tool of communication. They understood that in a way that we theoretically do, but in practice we find very hard to grasp. So we're now in the era of strategic communications being a primary weapon, which is not something NATO is comfortable with.
Okay, I want to start taking questions from people, and we're going to talk more about Ukraine. So please do start putting your questions in the Q&A box, and then we can put them to Mark. Mark, I think you know that we've traveled in Ukraine quite a bit, and also in the Baltic states. And Ukraine's probably an obvious, and because of the conflict in the Donbass, people are very acutely aware of what Russia's doing, and there are all sorts of different narratives, whether it's on the internet, Twitter, but also among different populations and how that varies from one place to another. But I find the Baltics fascinating because they're very small states, small populations, and people are acutely aware of Russia's threat to them, if you like. It's something that they think is as a real possibility. Can you just talk about what StratCom, but also NATO set up within those states, just as an examples of the way you've changed the way NATO works by not just relying on troops?
Yeah, well, there's two things. One, a use of troops, but in a particularly interesting way. And the other one is that the Baltics have often been leaders in StratCom because they've understood the way that the Russians have been using information confrontation against them. Lithuania, for instance, creating a authorized history so that the Russian narratives that Lithuania isn't a proper country wouldn't work. So they have been quite advanced. I've learned a lot from the Baltics. And one of the things that happened is that Latvia set up what's a center of excellence. Now, these are international military organizations, they're not formally part of NATO, but the centers of excellence for things for topics in order to provide, if you like, a good learning opportunity, experience, teaching. And the StratCom Center of Excellence is in Riga, Latvia. So they've been very good at understanding this kind of thing. The other side of it is that we have small numbers of troops in each of the Baltic states and Poland in what's called the Enhanced Forward Presence, which is a battalion-sized group. In other words, not really capable of fighting a war. I mean, if the Russians went in, they're not going to last too long. But they're from the major nations. And this is a very strong message, because what it's saying to the Russians is you could invade Estonia, but you can't invade Estonia without killing Brits.
Well, that's a theory. It's called blood in the snow, or blood on the snow.
That's right. And so it brings them in. And therefore, for a small use of force, which although the Russians try to pretend it's a threat, nobody believes that. I mean, 5,000 people aren't going to get us to the gates of Moscow, and that's the lot for the Baltics. But it provides a very effective deterrent. And it reassures the Estonians, the Latvians, and the Lithuanians that we support them. So that's proper StratCom, because it's not just a fancy words or a lecture. It's words, actions, and that's the critical thing, the linkage between the words and the actions. And what you're seeing in the Balkans and the Baltics is a link between words and actions, and that's proper StratCom.
Well, it's been a really good conversation so far, first 30 minutes or so, and we've got questions coming in, but let's just turn our eyes now to Ukraine. You've talked about StratCom. Give us your assessment of what you think Russia is trying to do at the moment. Is this serious? I mean, it looks to me like an enormous build-up, a military build-up, with one, as I said in the introduction, with one clear purpose in mind, and that's invasion. What do you think is going on?
Well, first of all, you're right. It's absolutely serious. I think, you know, I'm not. It's not rocket science to work out that Putin has marched his troops up to the top of the hill, and it's going to be very difficult to walk down them without either a significant concession or a fight. So I think, in a way, he has almost painted himself into a corner. The demands he's made of NATO, at one level, he's absolutely serious about. He wants to return Russia to the position it had in the mid-90s. I mean, he's serious.
And just to repeat his demands, they are what? What are his demands?
So part of it is that no further enlargement of NATO, guarantees that Ukraine and Georgia, but Ukraine is the topic, will not be allowed to be into NATO, but also a withdrawal of multinational troops from existing NATO members, and a changes to exercises and nuclear weapons, which would in effect withdraw the US presence from NATO. In other words,
basically, effectively give up the protection that all those members of NATO have joined for.
Exactly. I mean, it's an absolutist, and he is serious at one level, because this is a man who is committed in his heart and soul to returning Russia to a kind of great power status. Even he knows he's not going to get that. In Ukraine, I think he believes that he can achieve something in Ukraine. And part of this is because Russia wants to create a kind of neutral zone around itself. And I think at heart, this is what people mean when they talk about the Russian near abroad, is that what Russia believes, and this goes back centuries to their narratives and their security consideration, that Russia has been invaded from outside too often by mighty powers who never quite managed to win. And so what they want is they want a vast belt of neutral or Russian-controlled countries around them, so that no enemy will be able to get to the holy soil of Russia. And they want Ukraine to be part of that. Personally, Putin himself definitely wants to unite Belarus, Ukraine, Russia into one country. But I think the key thing is to get that beaten zone.
We've got the question coming up from Simon Jackson. If we can just bring him up so he can put his question to Mark in a second, that would be great. But just looking at those troops and looking at the enormous size of Ukraine, I mean, what do you think of the options? I'm just speaking to, I mean, you know, I know people who are in shape, and you are going to know far more people than I do, people who have retired and moved on. What's your sense, or what's possibly their sense of what his options are and what he could do?
I think he's got a lot of options, so people are not sure which one he could choose. I think the all-out assault, I don't think is an option, because once you take territory, you've got to hold it. And I think that they would be in a world of pain if they tried to hold. What he might well do is he might want to join up the Donbass with Crimea and take full control of the Sea of Azov. But if he did do that, that doesn't preclude them launching attacks elsewhere to split Ukrainian forces, because obviously they outnumber Ukrainian forces. But if it was very obvious where their main axis was, then the Ukrainians could concentrate. So if they do something like that, I would expect to see a lot of activity elsewhere. And what's interesting is that over the last 2 days, open source is a lot of stuff going into Belarus. And again, open source media, you know, Telegraph and the stuff that open source is wonderful, is highlighting a lot of professional soldiers are being turned out and they're being told we're going away for 6 months. So I think the most likely thing, if he does it, will be a limited land grab, but with activity going on in quite a lot of other places to ensure you spread Ukrainian forces. and how much they then go in for air power and airstrikes depends how much violence they want to inflict.
Well, one thing that struck me, Mark, was when we were there in I think it was 2015, on the back of the Maidan revolution, how easy it was for the Russians to take a city essentially by just taking the municipality. I mean, Kharkiv, a city of 1 million people, I think almost taken, certainly the local police, I think, would have been on the Russian side. Special police had to come from Ukraine to take it back again. So sometimes I wonder, how difficult would it be? I understand the long-term, repercussions. How do you hold that territory for a long period of time? But I don't know. Let's take some questions now. Simon Jackson.
The West keeps spluttering that if he moves on Ukraine, he's jolly well going to regret it. But what can we actually do that he would regret?
Really good question.
I think the level of financial sanctions that we have would be very, very painful, especially if they're sustained. The issue is that I think we can assume that if we do that to him, then the supply of gas to Germany will dry up immediately. And you're already seeing that they've in effect been rationing the gas supplies. They've not, for instance, the Ukrainians reporting that various tranches of gas supply they were expected to take up, they've not taken up. So they're already, if you like, running the West down to a point that if they turned off the gas, it would very quickly hurt. So I think how he gets hurt is quite difficult to see. There are things you can do. You could probably shut down Russia with massive cyber attacks if they're willing to do that. You probably could basically take all the money of his oligarchs. It depends how ruthless you're prepared to be. I think it's also quite clear that you could put a lot more forces, whatever he did, as soon as the fighting stopped, then Ukraine would become much better armed. So I think there's a lot. I mean, the thing about any war is, whatever you think is going to happen on day one, you don't know how it's really going to work out. I think the Ukrainians, it's easy to dismiss them. They were unready. Their leadership was split. There was a lot of pro-Russian senior generals and so on. But if you look at the Ukrainian fighting record in the Second World War and the Ukrainian record of fighting guerrilla war, they were every bit as good as the Russians. And so if the Russians think that the Ukrainians are going to lie down, I think that's a big mistake. I think that the Ukrainians are much more ready to do things. But I agree with the implicit nature of it, that unless we are prepared to take some big risks, then making Putin feel like he's really going to suffer could be quite hard.
Cyber, I mean, I just was struck by the very first thing you mentioned, which was, with cyber warfare, you could sort of close down Russian institutions. I mean, what kind of response is that going to get? That's an aggressive action from NATO. That's a military action in some way or other, isn't it?
Well, it's all deniable. That's the whole point about cyber, isn't it?
Right. So,
I don't want to be cynical, but I mean, the Russians have been carrying, and the Chinese, but the Russians more, have been carrying out cyber attacks against us. And every single one, they've said, oh, no, not us, Gov. Well, the fact is that the whole point about cyber is that essentially it's unprovable. But often you send the message is, yeah, it was us, but you can't prove it, screw you. So I would expect to see cyber attacks. Okay,
well, I want to ask a more general question, which is, do you see this? Do you see Russia acting out of a position of weakness? It seems to me that the French and the Germans think that you basically keep talking to Putin and things are going to be okay. He's not going to damage our interests. But obviously, you take a much more assertive response to Russia than they do.
Well, the thing is, I think Putin believes that he is in a current position of what may well be temporary strength. He's spent a bucket of money on his forces. His forces are much stronger than they were. He's got advantages in certain weaponry, potentially hypersonics, but certainly his ability to do what they would call anti-access aerial denial with the surface-to-air missiles he's got. He's got a lot of medium-range ballistics, and they're very good, I would say, at information warfare in the technical sense. And he thinks that the West is divided, which to some degree is true, and he believes that Biden is weak. So he would, and he also thinks it's winter and the Germans are a bunch of wusses who just want to make sure their fire's turned on. So I think he would say that he's got a window of opportunity. I think if you then start stepping back, economically, Russia, is still, I think, is about the size of Italy economically. Its demography is horrible. It's demographically in a mess. Its industrialization, its economic performance is still rubbish. It's not getting better. In the longer term, oil and gas isn't going to work as much because the world really is going to move away from it. And then if he had any sense, he would look at China, which will just see Russia as a useful idiot because China's got ambitions down south. So I think in the longer term, Russia's got some severe problems. And of course, this is one of the classic things, is that you strike not because you are strong, you strike because you fear impending weakness, that now is the time to grab it while you can. And I think that's a fair reason. One can never be certain about that, but I think that's a good piece of logic.
I'm fascinated with that last bit, and because if you think that Ukraine can arm itself more effectively, we saw in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Turkey supplying the Azeris with drones. And there's evidence that those drones are being used by Ukraine on attacks in Donbass, which shows you that the Turks are supplying them quite happily, supplying them to the Ukrainians, knowing that they're going to hit the Russians. And the Russians in turn will see that as a NATO step. Turkey being a member of NATO. So there's multiple ways to look at it. If you did take part of Ukraine, I presume that leaves, if you took Ukraine up to the Dnieper, which basically could include Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, and going all the way down to Odessa, gives you the military industrial complex that used to be where Russian missiles, helicopters were made in that area. So it's a sort of an area that they would like, but then it leaves you a whole swathe, a massive swathe, another 2/3 of almost of Ukraine, for them to basically continue their attacks on Russia thereafter. Give us an overview, Mark, of what exists in terms of material lined up along the border. It's not, some military nerds are going to know it. I'm looking at, I can see one nerd watching actually, and that is Tim Ripley, who writes for Jane's Defense, and I'm hoping that Tim will come up and ask you some nasty questions, because he can ask nastier questions than I can. So if we can get Tim up and ask a question, that'd be very good. But just tell us what's amassed on Ukraine's borders and where it's all come from, because it's a huge amount, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the simplest way to put it is that it's a full spectrum, well-balanced force with a lot of tactical groups which are trained and intended and equipped for a rapid assault. So in other words, if you were designing a force to do an attack, that's the force you would design. And then that has got the depth. There's a lot of logistical backup. They've got a lot of stuff which is permanently there anyway, within range. They've been moving artillery systems, all this kind of stuff. So it's a well-balanced force, spread fairly evenly. It's got 2 or 3 groupings which could attack any number of points. So this is an offensively orientated force with the logistic backups to sustain. So that's why people are worried. Now, if you want, how far you want to go, you then need follow-up forces. So the follow-up forces are there to a degree, but probably not as much as they would need to be. Life could prove me wrong. I think that if Russia went to the Dnieper, they would be a pariah state forever, but also they would find it very hard to hold on to that. The places where they could hold on to are the ones which are largely Russian speakers who are already somewhat disenchanted. This is not going to work if you take Kiev. It just simply isn't going to. So what they're doing is that they are in effect going to Ukrainian heartland, and Ukrainian heartland will not give in easily. And I think that, so I think that's, I could be proved wrong, but I think that's a step too far.
Right. Okay. Tim, you're there. You're a skeptic about a lot of this, aren't you? You don't quite believe essentially the whole hysteria about Russian invasion. Tim, you need to open your microphone if you're going to talk. Silence from Tim, or he's struggling to. Can you hear us, Tim? I'm going to ask what I think is the question that he might have asked.
Oh, here we go.
There you go, Tim. There you go.
Right.
Technically competent, or anyway, go on. Technically challenged.
The question. Are we not leading the Ukrainians down the garden path? Because both President Biden and Ben Wallace have openly said in the past month that Britain and the United States are not going to send their soldiers to die in the Ukraine. They've openly said that repeatedly. President Biden even said it last night. And so all this stuff about the Britain and the United States are shoulder to shoulder with Kiev. We're going to stand by Ukraine. We are there for the long haul. It's all puff. And as we saw in Afghanistan, Britain and the United States have, and President Biden has made it pretty clear that the idea of American soldiers dying in a foreign war is over. He's not going to do it. So,
but isn't that's all beside the point, Tim? Isn't that all beside the point?
No. But the point is, by at the same time having that as your policy, but your rhetoric is that you are standing up to Russia, you are heading for a disaster, because the two things don't add up. At some point, the Russians will call our bluff, and the house of cards will fall apart, just as it did in Kabul. So is it not better to be realistic and say, let's organize a deal and stop all this war hysteria?
Ooh.
Well, I think you've set up a scarecrow. I mean, I think leading the Ukrainians down a gilded path, I mean, they're perfectly well aware that they're not going to get troops. So I don't think anyone's misleading them. I think the Ukrainians are very well aware of the limits of NATO intervention. And you know, if you look what they're asking for, they're not asking for troops. They're asking for weapons, to which some degree they're getting, and they're asking for sanctions, and they'd like them now. So I think you've set up a false narrative there, I have to say, Tim. In terms of whether we should do a deal, I mean, again, it's not up to us to do a deal for the Ukrainians. You know, we shouldn't be doing a Yalta. I think I went to Ukraine a lot post 2014, and they don't want to be in the Russian orbit. I think they've been made quite clear the degree to which they're going to be supported, and I think they're realistic about that. And I don't think we should do a deal over their head. So if the Ukrainians, if Zelensky and other people say, well, I think we need to deal with Putin, then that's their call. But I think saying to them, well, we're going to definitely abandon you, and therefore we want you to give in to Putin, I just don't think that's right.
But Mark, I think this is the question which is really interesting, and it's the same. Simon Jackson's asking the same question. It's really the fundamental question is that here's Russia willing to go and poison people with nerve agents or radioactive material, happy to go and prop up, you know, a homicidal dictator in Iraq, although it has to be said that America's done all of that in the past too, and basically invade other countries willy-nilly. And we see this as a country not playing by the rules. Now, of course, we can say, you know, the United States has done this in Iraq, and you know, the mother can be slung both ways. But I think we'd all agree we see Russia as a threat to the kind of global stability that we favour. But there's a powerlessness there. It seems to us that you cannot stop Russia from invading Ukraine, Georgia, pretty much more or less wherever it wants to. I mean, how does Russia get a bloody nose? It doesn't seem to.
Well, I mean, it's a good point, and it's the defender's dilemma, no question. But what I would point out is the sense that it would stop there is for the birds. If you think, you know, this in this sense, and I make no bones about it, this is the Munich 1938 comparison. We kept thinking that we could buy off Hitler, and he kept finding other things. Now, Putin has made it quite clear what he wants. And, you know, if we are stupid enough to think that, oh, he's joking about rolling back the rest of NATO, more fool us. He's been, if you look at his record, if you look at what he's said, he is very consistent. So the point about it is, whatever the dilemma, and I accept the powerlessness argument is strong, but do not think that if they bite off a bit of Kiev, a bit of Ukraine, that it stops there, because it won't. Because the Baltic states are on the border. There's a reason why the Swedes are building up forces in Gotland. He is not going to stop there.
Yeah, and I guess the theory is that he'd like to prove NATO's powerlessness and ultimately making its association or making NATO futile.
And so if he succeeds in one place, it will encourage him in another. And it will not stop there. And also, don't underestimate, you know, again, we've got ourselves talking about the military action. If he succeeds in Ukraine, you will see a massive redoubling, quadrupling of the hybrid conflict, of the trolling, of the narrative peddling to disrupt, destabilize, and intervene in our countries. I mean, remember, he has already played in America, and what he's done is he's played on our weaknesses, but he didn't need to do that. He did that because he saw us as weak and he could get away with it. So if he went into Ukraine and became popular and felt it was succeeding and he's returning Russia to its top table, he will be redoubling the hybrid gray zone activities in the Baltics, in the Eastern European countries, and in Britain. So we are, I believe, quite genuine, we are already in a form of war. Quite genuinely in a form of war. And if you read the Russian literature, they believe they are at war. It's not me, you know, some kind of Cold War warrior lost. This is reading what Russians say. They think they're in war. And for us to sort of say, oh, well, yeah, I mean, Ukraine, big country of which we know little, screw it. It ain't going to end there any more than it ended with the the Czech Republic.
Yeah. I'm going to have more questions from other people. If I don't get questions from other people, it's just going to be the Tim and Nick show along with Mark, and we'll wrap it up very shortly. So, but I will take another question from Tim if you're there, you still are, and possibly again from Simon Jackson. But please do get another question in, please, everybody else.
There's a great many sort of different schools of Putin's studies and criminology and theories of what drives the great man in his his quests and endeavors around the world. Now, Mark, you're an exponent of the what you call the greater Russia theory and his messianic crusade to restore Russia to a great power and all that good stuff. Now, there's also a very, very big school of Russian experts who describe Russia as a not narco state, a crypto, a kleptography. I may get my words wrong, but
kleptocracy.
Yes,
kleptocracy.
It's the people at the top of Russia are only interested in money and their own position and power. They are obsessed by wealth, by everything that goes with it, and they are obsessed by the Russian economy, by making the companies that they own rich. And Russia's main source of money is gas and oil. It is a hydrocarbon state, and its main customer is Western Europe. And at the moment, the price of gas and oil are at their highest due to the pandemic and lots of other things. So it would seem to be a point of if you ascribe to the view that they are interested in maximizing their wealth, why engage in a war that will result in lots of sanctions that will result in their main source of money being cut off? This is a point over the next year, 2 years, they're going to make the most amount of money out of their oil and gas exports that they ever will. And the gas pipeline to Germany is going to make them even more money. And you saw it in November when Lukashenko and his migrant thing screwed the whole thing up and resulted in the Nord Stream pipeline being cut off just after 10 years of effort. And it was about to happen, and it got cut off.
I think Tim, you're offering an analysis there, not a question.
Well, the question is, how does that square with the view that all they're interested in is capturing a backward East European country that's going to offer them no?
I'll give you an answer, because the oligarchs all serve Putin, and it's his interest. They only make money when according under his mandate.
That's part of it. Is, as Nick has just said, they're his creatures. But I think also you're being too absolutist. They may be money obsessed, which I completely agree with you are. They are, stupid things like, somebody's got a 101 meter yacht, so I'm going to build one that's 102 meters, all that kind of nonsense. But there are also Russians, and Russians have a worldview. And the worldview is of a mighty Russia. Now, they may not be as obsessive as Putin, and this is a Putin vision I've talked about, and he's the man in charge. And there's no suggestion that anyone's going to topple him. I think he is obsessive to a degree that many other people aren't, but that doesn't mean they don't share his basic view of wanting Russia to be a great power. The Ruski Mir narrative is real, even in people who've got more money than they know what to do with by a billion times. So I think when you say they're only interested in money, I think that's the mistake. They're primarily interested in money, yeah. And as long as Putin is the person who controls their ability to get that money, they'll do what he says. And I think if they believe they can get the greater Russia power and their money, they'll be fine. Right. And if they can lose, and remember, they're so rich, they don't need any money for a year. So the fact that there is a few months interruption, they will make the calculation, is this my gas cut off forever? Now that might change how they look at the world, but I don't think at the moment they'll be making that calculation.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. I'm hoping you can stay with us. We're going to have a short break. I'm going to give, there are a few questions here. I'm just going to give us a flavor of them. One person here says, I'm not clear as to what actions we should take and could take at this stage that would have any effect and not shoot ourselves in the foot as a result. And then somebody else says, if Putin takes Ukraine, so what? You know, we'll just crack on. And then another commentary here, and we'll be able to raise these questions after the break. What does this say about us? That is the rest of us outside Russia. We'll come to those questions in just a second. Mark, Laity, just to sum the hour up, it's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm hoping you can stay with us after the break, but I just want to say thank you to you now.
No, I'll stay. So you tell me how long the break is, and I'll come back.